Professor Dr. Zoe Trodd from the UK. She is a professor for American literature, and she is at the Institute for Amerikanistik and Kanadistik, for American Studies and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham. And her theme is Sklaverei, heute, moderne Sklavenhandel. I haven't had a break, so I'm sorry, I'm mixing the languages. And I think we shall hear a definition before we see things which I'm sure will give us a very lot to talk about. Zoe, the floor is yours.
I want to just start by offering just some of the more reliable facts and figures for contemporary slavery, and including slavery today, actually, and in Germany and Europe. Slavery is not legal anywhere, but it happens everywhere. There are approximately 30 million slaves alive in the world, so 29.8 is the most accurate, the best, the most recent figure. It comes from the recent Global Slavery Index, which was issued a few months ago by the Walk Free Foundation, and this was after a long period of research and data gathering. And it builds on the previously accepted figure, which was 27 million people enslaved. That was a number calculated by the scholar Kevin Bales in the late 1990s, and this number is now grown. It's more slaves than at any point in human history. It's more people than were stolen from Africa in the whole 400-year transatlantic slave trade. This is a number that's greater than the population of Australia. It's almost the population of Canada. It's almost 7 times the population of Ireland. The countries with the highest numbers of enslaved people, as you can see, are India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Russia, Thailand, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Bangladesh. So taken together, these countries account for 76% of the total estimate of enslaved people in the world. But the number does include 60,000 enslaved people in the US, and it includes about 10,500 enslaved people in Germany. This is the full table for the estimated actual prevalence of slavery, and this is for each of the 37 countries in Europe. It also has an estimate of the proportion of slavery cases that are not known to governments. So the estimate now is that there are around 1.1 million enslaved people in Europe. The largest numbers are in the Russian Federation, the Ukraine, Poland. The smallest numbers are in Luxembourg, Iceland. Globally, about half of these slaves are female and half are male. Also, about half are children. That's the same breakdown as well for Europe. People here are enslaved in a variety of forms: forced prostitution, domestic service, agriculture, industry. About half, actually, in Europe are in forced prostitution. That's different, of course, to the global proportion. Only 20% of slaves worldwide are actually in forced prostitution. The rest, 80%, are in forced labor. They're in carpet looms, stone quarries, kilns, fisheries, mines, forests. So in other words, although the form of slavery that we probably hear the most about here in Europe is based on sexual exploitation, meaning, this is the form that the media does like to focus on quite a lot. That isn't the predominant form at all worldwide. And this research was also calculating that in most European countries, more than 90% of slavery is unidentified, unreported in official or law enforcement data and estimates. And just to think about that for a moment, the shocking nature of that dark figure of 90%, just imagine that 90% of all homicides in any European country was going undetected. There exist very few assessments of at least the forced labor side of this European slavery. There's a real vacuum of information there, and that tends to be taken as a sign that forced labor trafficking is not so serious. So you have a lot of regional and national, international events and media reports focusing on trafficking for sexual exploitation mainly. It means one major and actually quite basic challenge for the EU is to shift its focus to encompass slavery in all of its forms, including labor exploitation and trafficking for forced labor. Just briefly on what forms this slavery takes globally, the 3 main forms are chattel slavery, debt bondage slavery, and contract slavery. Chattel slavery, this is the form that we're most familiar with from history. This is where someone is born, sometimes sold into permanent slavery. Ownership is asserted here. This is the form of slavery that's still dependent on racial difference, and this is taking place in Mauritania, Nigeria, Mali, and Chad. This is a woman named Tamada on the right. She was born into chattel slavery in Nigeria. She escaped with her children, though, at the age of 20. Debt bondage slavery is where a person pledges themselves against a loan of money, but the length and the nature of that debt is never defined. Their labor, their service, it never diminishes the original debt. This is the most common form of slavery today. This is what's taking place in South Asia, especially India, Pakistan, and Nepal. This is a man called Rampal. He was actually enslaved as a child in debt bondage. His father had taken a loan 25 years earlier. The debt hadn't diminished at all. He was in a stone quarry. And actually with the 200 other enslaved residents of his village, they rose up in this mass rebellion, liberated their village. Then the third major form is contract slavery. This is where a contract seems like it guarantees employment, but when the worker arrives at their workshop or factory, they find they've been enslaved, their passport has been taken, they cannot leave, they're not paid. This is often what takes place in Western Europe and the US. It's actually the most rapidly growing form of slavery today. And the Maria on the right immigrated legally to Mexico, from Mexico to the US when she was 15 with her father. She was actually approached on the street in LA by a man offering her work as a cleaner, but instead she was sold to another man for $200. He made her his domestic slave. He held her captive for 5 years in his house, raped her, forced her to work. So those are some numbers and some forms, but you of course have to be careful with definitions. And when I'm talking about slavery, I want to be really clear, I don't mean sweatshop labor or extreme poverty or all prostitution. Slaves today are paid nothing. They cannot walk away. They are forced to work against their will. So the labor power is being stolen now as it was in the 19th century. Any kind of agreed upon definition of slavery, though, has been controversial. There's been an inability to clarify a definition, and this hasn't helped in eradicating it. What's missing has been a definition that is dynamic, but also quite universal. So you can identify slavery no matter how it's evolving and changing. I recommend, as a definition, the Bellagio Harvard Guidelines on the legal parameters of slavery. This was written in 2012 by a network of 20 scholars of international law and slavery, also by anti-slavery leaders, some politicians. And what it does is it uses the legal definition of slavery from the 1926 Slavery Convention, which is up on the screen. You can read it. Slavery is the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. And of course today, legal ownership is no longer asserted. So these guidelines say that the exercise of the powers attaching to the right of ownership should be understood as possession. So control over a person by another, such as a person might control a thing. So slavery is defined now as controlling a person in such a way as you significantly deprive them of individual liberty, and your intent here is to exploit through use and management and purchase, sale, profit, transfer, disposal of that person. Of course, nearly every culture, nearly every historical period has known slavery. It's been packaged differently at every different time and place. Different packaging occurs when slavery is legal, when it's made illegal, when you have different notions about race, when the price of slaves goes up and down. But the true nature of slavery does not exist in its packaging, its justification, its origin point. So across history, its core characteristics have been the same. These are people being controlled through violence, forced to make money, having no control over what type of work they do, their work environment, the conditions of their work, their freedom of movement in the context of that work. So when those of us who look at slavery encounter an individual situation of extreme exploitation, the first question is, can this person walk away? And a key marker of enslavement tends to be this loss of free will, this loss of free movement. I do also quickly want to make it plain that human trafficking is not in itself slavery. It is a process by which slavery can be achieved. It is definitely the case that a lot of people think trafficking is a form of slavery. A lot of people have heard about human trafficking, but not contemporary slavery. There's been movies about it. I put just 3 of them up on the screen. It's been seeping into TV shows as well. Trafficking, though, is the mechanism, the conduit that brings some people into enslavement. You might come into slavery through many paths, but again, the means of enslavement, the vehicle, does not determine that state of enslavement. It's just the means by which you arrive under the control of another. As well, trafficking is a small part of the global picture. There are around 2.5 million people in the world who are enslaved after having been trafficked. So 10%, roughly, of all slaves. Most slaves then are sedentary. They haven't been moved from one place to another. Although in the case of Europe, those who are trafficked do make up a larger proportion of those who are enslaved. It's also true that even this relatively small proportion of trafficking has become the 3rd largest criminal industry in the world, so after arms smuggling and drug smuggling. And it's also the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. I'm going to run through some slides to keep on time. One key element of this industry is that today's slaves are cheaper than they've ever been. So on average, a slave costs $90 in the world today. It's less than 1% of the average price of a slave in the US, in Alabama, for example, in the 1850s. It's one of the main differences between today's slavery and earlier forms. Slaves have been these very expensive capital purchases for all of recorded history. The price of slaves over the last 4,000 years has averaged between 10,000 and 40,000 US dollars in today's currency. But the slave that cost $40,000 equivalent in the 1850s cost less than $100 today. So slaves are cheap. Profit margins are huge. There's this surplus of potential slaves, the very poor, the very vulnerable in the developing nations. There are a few other differences that are worth mentioning between new and old slavery. In addition to the cost, old slavery had slave owners, people legally asserting and documenting ownership. And of course, today's slavery, because it's illegal, has no legal ownership. We have just slave holders instead. And then there's racial difference. That was obviously important to old slavery. Today's slavery is no longer racialized, except in Mauritania and Sudan. So race, caste, tribe, religion, these do initially look like markers of slavery because it's minority peoples who are the ones most often trafficked and enslaved within their countries. But that's because these differences have made them vulnerable to slave traders. They are the poor, they are the ostracized. Slavery is not justified by race anymore. Race is not at the heart of slavery. And it's in part because of those differences that the obstacles that abolitionists faced in the past have either been torn down or just blown away. The moral argument is now won. Every country condemns slavery, at least on paper. No powerful religious group is trying to argue that it's desirable. There's also no economic argument to be won. The monetary value of this slavery in the world economy is relatively small. Slave-based revenues are flowing not to support national economies, even transnational industry, but these quite small-scale criminal networks. So the end of slavery basically threatens no country's livelihood. The cost of ending slavery is just a fraction of what these freed slaves will pump into the economies. And then third, there's no legal argument. We don't have to win that again. Mostly the necessary national and international laws are on the books. We can update some, we can expand some. Some need their penalties increasing. But there's nowhere on earth now where slavery is legal. One area we can focus, though, is on trade. And so I do want to end by talking about that. Throughout history, slavery has adapted fluidly to a changing world, and it continues to do so today. As the ILO puts it, slavery and trafficking are the underside of globalization. New forms of bondage spread slaves and slave-based activities around the globe with very little government control. And within the financial systems of globalization, without labor market regulation, slave profits are flowing smoothly across national borders. Governments find it very difficult, often impossible, to stop this flow of money. So a country's laws, when they stop at its border, let the global slave traffic flow over and under these borders. A lot of human traffickers operate over the internet, so they're using this global reach to find customers, to make deals. And with slavery illegal everywhere, slaveholders and traders have to act in these similarly clandestine ways. They hide their slaves, they squeeze out profits. So this is a global economy where money and goods and people are flowing in a lot of directions, but with slave traffickers increasingly running their businesses in very similar ways. For example, in Brazil, slaves are recruited in very densely populated, economically depressed regions. They're shipped over 1,000 miles to forests where they're forced to make charcoal. The charcoal, in turn, is shipped another 1,000 miles to be used in steel mills. That steel is sold to Canada and the US, and the EU imports nearly 1 million tons of Brazilian steel each year, producing everything from cars to toys to buildings. And then meanwhile, you have investment from Europe supporting those charcoal operations of Brazil. So it's true that a lot of today's slave labor is aimed just at local sale, local consumption, but we have these slave-made goods filtering throughout the global economy. So millions of slaves in India might just grow food and quarry stone and make commodities that are used in their towns and villages, but rugs made by slave children in India and Pakistan and Nepal are mainly exported to Europe and the US. So globalization, meaning the goods we buy, are increasingly assembled in different parts of the world using components from all over the world, means slavery can creep into any one of the numerous steps and parts that go into making a product. In fact, slaves are used to produce many of our basic commodities. One organization, Slavery Footprint, actually lets you find out how many slaves you have working for you, producing the goods that you buy and use. And there are these documented cases of slavery in our carpets and cocoa, beef, tomatoes, lettuce, and other fruits and vegetables, shrimp, gold, tin, diamonds, shoes, clothing, fireworks, rope, rugs, rice, bricks. Coffee is sometimes grown with slave labor. Sugar is harvested using slaves. In the Congo, armed gangs force local villagers to dig a mineral, tantalum. And the gangs sell that to exporters who send it to Europe and Asia for the use in the production of cell phones, computers. Governments and industries, though, they can intervene. Businesses have started trying to help stop slavery by cleaning up their product chains. One thing the EU maybe is possibly starting to think about is a law that's similar to the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act of 2010. There's also a version of this before the UK Parliament. It's called the Transparency in UK Company Supply Chains Bill. And what it does is it requires all companies over a certain size to publish information about the efforts they are making to ensure slavery is not in their supply chains. So this EU directive on transparency in supply chains, if it ever comes about, would be aimed at companies in the EU that have annual receipts exceeding 100 million euros. It would increase their company's accountability. It would encourage them to be proactive in addressing slavery through compliance systems. They would be required to disclose this information in their annual reports on their websites. The EU would highlight the good work of companies that have made sure their supply chains are slavery-free. This would help move these corporations towards ethical sourcing. I think as well, small alterations in the business tax regime could deliver significant support to these actively responsible companies. And at the same time, the EU could start inviting civil society groups more to engage with companies to help identify slavery in their supply and sometimes subcontracting chains, to carry out independent third-party reviews of company programs. The EU could start bringing everyone together who benefits from a commodity or a product to clean up that product supply chain, along the lines of the International Cocoa Initiative, if people have heard about that. So basically act as a matchmaker between competing companies and the anti-slavery movement in this process, so bring together these stakeholders. And at a higher level, the issue of slavery in the supply chain can and I think should be dealt with in the governance of international trade. So at the most basic level, and very permissible within the trade regulations of the World Trade Organization, is just a simple prohibition, saying that no slave-made goods or commodities can be imported into the EU. In addition to working with business, the EU could also negotiate trade agreements with non-EU countries that prohibit the circulation of goods produced using slave labor. So it could pass and enforce a law that slave-made goods should not be imported into, exported out of, or just even through the EU. So slavery, it is itself a drag on both trade and on national economies, and we could make its eradication a key element of trade law. Another thing the EU could do is to develop and to publish an annual country-specific list of goods that are produced by forced labor in non-EU countries and EU countries, specify that the problem has to be significantly reduced for that country to be removed from this list. So one useful model is the US government's list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor, fairly recent initiative. If governments don't respond, if they're not implementing systems of inspections, protections, the EU could reduce import quotas from those countries. And then finally, I guess just to end on this, governments do need to enforce their own anti-slavery laws, and to make this happen, every country has to understand that they must take action or face significant pressure. The EU could encourage EU and non-EU countries to establish slavery inspectorates. So it could really lead the way here. It could make slavery inspectorates part of national labour inspectorates. It could be supported by the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work, aimed at the industries and the economic sectors that are most likely to use slaves. So an inspection process here would identify slaves, it would deter employers from using them. The inspectors could help provide data for that list of slave-made goods. And of course, the verdict of these inspectorates need to be recognized by governments. Business entities need to have their licenses to trade taken away, property seized if they don't cease using slave labor. Private banks could be encouraged to refuse them credit. A useful model here is Brazil's dirty list. It's been issuing this since 2003. And it comprises the names of individuals and corporations that they deem responsible for situations of slavery. They subject them to sanctions, prevent them from accessing public funds. They update it every 6 months. They send it out to public service agencies and banks. Basically, it means no finance or grants or public credit is given to those on this list. And as well, just after that, in 2005, Brazil issued a national pact for the eradication of slave labor. 400 companies have joined it, all committed really to ensuring slave labor is not being used in their supply chains. So this is a moment in Brazil where the government started actually to empower the ILO, NGOs, trade unions to work with them to undertake a sort of independent supply chain analysis. I'll end there, and I'm going to look forward to questions when we get there. Thank you.